This is Reframe, the podcast from the College of Education, Health, and Society on the campus of Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. School mascots bring entertainment and excitement to so many sports. They can create a shared sense of identity and even foster a deep sense of community among fans. But some school mascots have also been called into question, especially those that can be seen as stereotypical or insensitive to various cultural subgroups. Here in Oxford, Ohio, this issue is also recently at the center of a very passionate debate around the use of a Native American mascot for the local Talawanda School District. And the story that followed became a fascinating story that touches upon aspects of moral psychology, the importance of local politics, and even the ways in which other schools may choose to navigate similar challenges. So today on the podcast, I want to welcome Dr. Sam Morris. He's a Miami University clinical professor of sport leadership and management, and he wrote the report in favor of dropping the Talawanda Native American mascot and changing the school's nickname. So Dr. Morris, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to begin by getting some background on this issue and on the mascot change. It really seems to have sparked a lot of engagement from a lot of people, especially those who are very passionate on both sides of the issue. So what was the genesis of this long debate and the mascot change, and where does this story really begin for anyone who is unfamiliar with what happened?
Yeah, it really picks up last fall, about a year ago, so that would have been the fall of 2018. I actually read in the Oxford Observer that the school district was going to reconsider the mascot because they'd been under some pressure. We've had some students express concerns about it. There were some implications about bullying. You know, some people lose sight of the fact that I don't think people always appreciate the fact that Native Americans still live here and in the community. And so their kids attend our schools, and it's, you know, they're fully embedded and entrenched just as anyone else is. And so there were some issues cropping up around that, and the school board decided to revisit the issue. It's the fourth or fifth time that they've considered changing it. So they convened a committee with a new superintendent and decided to revisit it. So I reached out to the school as an alum, as a local faculty member here. I've written about it. I published an article about this in an academic journal years ago, so I was pretty well informed on the issue. And I did. I asked if I could join the committee, and they were looking for balance. They wanted some folks who they thought would be eager to change. They wanted some folks who they thought would be eager to stay the same. And they wanted some folks who were undecided. And so that's how I got involved. That's how I got looped into it.
How did they respond to the fact that you are an academic who had already researched this, and how did your research fit into the conversation?
I don't think most people knew that. When I came in for the first committee meetings, you know, we're all introducing ourselves, and the way that my identity was framed, and it was first and foremost as an alum of the school. I'd been a student athlete as well. I'd played on the football and baseball team and had some success with that, and so that was a big part of it. And I was eager. There's also some what local folks call town and gown tension. Mm-hmm. And so I was eager not to be perceived as someone who was coming from the university to tell the high school how they should do things, because that's just presumptuous and condescending, and people in the community don't like it. Well, it's not necessarily that, but that's how it's perceived sometimes. So I was careful not to overplay the role of my identity that was an academic. But at the same time, I had written about it. I mean, I have careful and considered views about it that had gone through the peer review process, and so that indicates some degree of, you know, serious thinking on the topic. So only once the kind of committee got rolling and we were having discussions about, well, what does the research say here, did that part of who I am kind of get pulled in? Because it's inevitable at that point. You know, I'm not going to sit there and not mention that I happen to know all the peer-reviewed research on this.
Right.
So that's how that kind of came through. I had written a paper called "The Trouble with Mascots." Simple title. The Trouble with Mascots. And I had argued in that paper that the issue was ultimately about stereotyping, because that's what mascots do. They're meant to be representative. They're proxies. They're a stand-in for some virtue that you want to convey. So the issue to me was not necessarily whether it was a positive or a negative connotation. It was just that it was a connotation. It was just a stereotype. And so that's fine if you want to stereotype the Panthers or the Cougars or the Tigers or whatever, because it's different notions of doing harm. But in this case, you're talking about distinct ethnic groups of people who have a particular history that is not exactly something that we should be proud of. At least European Native American history. Most people know that story, so I don't need to get into those details. So it's different when you're stereotyping an ethnic group, particularly an ethnic group that's been treated the way those groups have been historically. So that's what makes the stereotyping a bit different for me. So I argued in that paper, the real trouble here is that we're stereotyping distinct ethnic groups of people, and no school board would be proud of that, right? That's not something I don't think a public school would want to convey to their students, that you ought to be stereotyping people. In some sense, it's a part of human nature. We do it because we pick up on patterns. It's just the way our brains work. But in some sense, that's kind of a glitch in the human psyche, not necessarily a feature of it. So we need to be aware of the fact that we stereotype and account for it. And so in that paper, I had argued that part of the trouble is that we're stereotyping those groups of people, and we probably shouldn't be doing that.
So I think really quickly we can talk ultimately about what did happen. So the name was officially changed. It went from the Talawanda Braves to the Talawanda Brave.
Yeah.
So that S was dropped. And then the school will no longer purchase or sell apparel and equipment with that Native American head logo. So when you were thinking about the final changes that you did want to see happen, were there originally more significant changes that were discussed and you decided on dropping the S because that maybe was seen as the most feasible or realistic compromise that could actually be achieved? Or what was that initial strategic planning process like?
Yeah. So to speak of the plan is kind of strange because it's a fairly organic process. And because we had about 15 or so people on the committee, some of us were pulling the rope one way and some of us are pulling the rope the other way. So it's not exactly like a cohesive plan. But the whole committee, to their credit, people on both sides of the issue, did end up putting up several possible solutions to the problem. And they included wholesale change, new mascot, everything. A second option was recommend wholesale change, but don't make any explicit recommendations about what. So we just say to the school board, dump the Braves mascot and all of that and find something new. Whatever you want new, it's up to you. So we didn't, we were a little bit less assertive there. The third option was the status quo, just leave everything the way it is. The fourth option was to just eliminate the Native American silhouette, keep the Braves, but just drop the Native American imagery that was associated with it. And then just become the Talawanda Brave, which, as you know, is ultimately what happened. Ultimately, that's where we sorted out was on to drop the S, because pragmatically, the folks who were pushing for a change saw that as the most feasible sell.
Now, what about those on the other side? I mean, aside from just keeping the status quo or making no change, what was the viewpoint of those who were opposed?
It boiled down to a question of perception, intent versus perception. So the argument always has been that this is meant to be honorable. It's meant to be something to be proud of. We're holding up this culture of people. But, again, the language isn't precise here. People forget that, you can't just broadly speak of Native Americans. There are hundreds and hundreds of Native nations. I mean, they're very different and diverse within themselves. So it's very weird to say like Native American culture when that's not some cleanly unified thing. Like there's a diaspora there. But anyway, so the argument was it's meant to represent sort of pride, honor, dignity, respect, bravery, and so forth. Which again, because the logo is a proxy, it's quite strange that you would imbue so much value into that mark when very clearly, it's very clear what you intrinsically care about is the virtue of bravery. And so in some sense, you're really not going to lose anything if you take this mark away and put that mark in, because the core thing that you care about is still there: bravery, courage, all that sort of stuff. And so that was the argument from the other side was tradition. This has always been a tradition. But the idea was that it was intended to be an honor. And of course, the tension is intent and perception is not always the same.
Was what you proposed, was that ultimately controversial? Did it raise more contention than you expected it to? Because it seems like a perfect compromise.
It didn't surprise me that it was still contentious and controversial, only because I knew, you need to know a good deal about moral psychology, about how people think about ethical decisions, because this is kind of a moral issue. And I've read some of the research on that. There's some very good work on it. And I know that once people commit, it's very hard to persuade them, and any change is unacceptable. So while it does, when we drafted that particular part of the proposal, let's just drop the S, we'll become the Talawanda Brave. It's very minimal rebranding from an economic perspective, right? There's not a lot of changes you have to make. And we had a very clear plan about how to do that, about phasing everything out. It's not some instantaneous wholesale change that's going to cost tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's a phase out. But even so, it's a very small change, Braves to Brave. And if anything, you're just eliminating things that you buy, right? You're eliminating the Native American Indian head, you're eliminating the S, you're reducing those things. So it seems like a no-brainer, right? That you can retain the core thing and the transition cost is minimal. But change is change. And I just knew that, I think we all knew that people were just going to fight like hell to keep it, because it's the thing that they love.
Well, I guess last question then, since you have been through this, what's some advice you would have for schools who want to make this change, who need to make this change?
Yeah, I think my advice would be to be very realistic about how difficult it's going to be. It is very difficult to wrap your head around how people are tied to these things, how emotionally caught up and bound in these marks and logos and images we are, and the way that we care about sports, which they are worth caring about. Sports are the kind of things that bring vivacity and richness and life and fun to our lives, and in some ways make our lives worth living. I mean, they're an expression of human freedom and joy and fun. And so it's right to care about them. But you got to be careful that you don't attach too much of your caring to the wrong things sometimes. I realize that I'm presuming that that's the wrong thing there, but I think I'm right about that one. So part of my advice would be to just be realistic about how difficult it's going to be. And the other thing, and this is kind of this is not something I'm thrilled to admit. In many ways, I think we all knew that it was going to come down to the school board members, right? We had 5 school board members. The only people's opinions in that entire process who matter were those 5 people. Other opinions mattered, but they didn't count, if you catch my distinction there. They mattered, but they didn't count. Mm-hmm. Those 5 people, their opinions counted. And right from the beginning, I approached it, and I know everyone else on that committee did, politically, because it's a political process. And when you're thinking politically, you're wondering who you can predict and who you can't. And I knew that there were at least 4 people of the 5 who I could predict. I knew that those 4 people were not going anywhere on their views. Well, I guess I didn't know that, but I was very confident, let's put it that way. And then there was a 5th who I had a pretty good indication. I think we all could have guessed, but we were much less certain. And so in some ways, all the work we did was for the swing vote. We're all working toward the swing vote. And again, knowing what I know about moral psychology and how resistant people are to changing their ideas and the way they think, I knew it was going to be hard to move somebody on this. When all the dust settled and the vote was done, I asked for a meeting with the swing vote. And so we talked. We sat down. We talked for about 90 minutes. And at the end of it, I said, did any of our work have anything to do with your decision? Had you made your mind up before we started? Did we really influence you at all? And I knew what he was going to say. And he said no. And so in some sense, it's like, we didn't do anything. We didn't do anything. Those 5 people had made their minds up before. I'm not 100% convinced of that. I think sometimes when you lay out the reasoning and the rationale, sometimes it does confirm your intuition. And that's a good thing. That's not to say it wasn't worth the effort. And that's what I mean. Like, if you want to go into something like that, you need to appreciate how hard it's going to be to make a difference. But that's kind of like, that's a perennial problem with everything. How do you go about tackling a problem not knowing whether you can make a difference? You never know until you go in.
It's also a really great example of what it's like to get involved in local community political life, in a real way, and how these things unfold. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, it's been fun. It's a fascinating subject, and it consumed a lot of my time last year, and I'll be curious to see how it unfolds over time.